The British royal family possesses some of the most valuable jewels in the world, but behind their brilliance lies a history of empire, conquest, and stolen wealth. For decades, African nations have called for the return of their looted treasures, yet the monarchy has largely remained silent. Now, with King Charles III facing increasing demands to acknowledge Britain's colonial past, and Labour leader Keir Starmer under pressure to take a stance on reparations, the story of Britain's wealth cannot be told without Africa. From the 1600s, as the British Empire expanded, so too did its hunger for resources, labour and power. But wealth wasn't just extracted through trade, it was stolen by force through invasion, war and destruction. One of the earliest British incursions into Africa was led by John Hawkins, a pioneer of the transatlantic slave trade, whose brutal expeditions along the West African coast, especially in present-day Sierra Leone, laid the foundation for Britain's economic dominance. Hawkins was knighted by Queen Elizabeth I for his efforts, and his ships bore the initials R.A., marking the start of the Royal African Company's direct involvement in the trade of human lives. Cities, streets, and even entire colonies, Virginia and Jamestown, were named in honor of the monarchy, whose wealth was deeply tied to Africa's suffering. By 1655, under King Charles II, Britain seized Jamaica from Spain, using it as a key point. In the triangular trade, where sugar, rum, and coffee enriched the monarchy and aristocracy, the Royal African Company, founded under his reign, controlled the trafficking of enslaved Africans, with tens of thousands perishing in its brutal grip. The money generated from these activities didn't just enrich merchants, it directly funded the development of royal estates, such as Kensington Palace. The Stuart monarchs, particularly James II, personally profited from the trade, using enslaved labour as currency in their economic rivalry with the Dutch. But Britain didn't just take Africa's people, it also took its greatest treasures. As British forces marched through Africa, they targeted its richest kingdoms, looting royal palaces and stripping leaders of their wealth. The Cullinan Diamond, the largest diamond ever found, was unearthed in South Africa in 1905. Though the British claim it was gifted to King Edward VII, the reality is that it was taken under colonial rule, with no benefit to the local African population. Today it sits proudly in the British Crown Jewels, a symbol of an empire built on stolen wealth. In 1897, British forces launched a violent raid on the Kingdom of Benin, in present-day Nigeria. The royal palace was set ablaze, and thousands of sacred bronze plaques, statues and artefacts were looted, many of which now sit in the British Museum. These artefacts weren't just art, they held the history, religion, and identity of an entire people. In 1868, after the British defeated Emperor Tewodros II at Magdala, soldiers ransacked his palace, looting crowns, religious manuscripts, and sacred tablets, some of the holiest artifacts in Ethiopian Orthodox Christianity. These treasures were taken back to Britain and never returned, and the Ashanti Empire in Ghana was one of Africa's wealthiest kingdoms, famed for its gold. During the Anglo-Ashanti Wars, British forces looted the royal treasury, seizing gold regalia, ceremonial swords, and royal stools. Today, these items remain in British collections, despite repeated requests for their return. For decades, African nations have demanded the return of their stolen treasures, but Britain has consistently refused, using weak justifications like preservation and shared history. In reality, these artifacts are not just museum pieces, they are symbols of colonial conquest and oppression. When slavery was abolished in the British Empire, the government didn't compensate the formerly enslaved. Instead, they paid massive sums to the slave owners. This compensation, enacted under Queen Victoria, cost the British taxpayer for generations, with the final payments only being completed in 2015. Meanwhile, the descendants of those enslaved, both in Africa and the Caribbean, received nothing. So when Britain argues that these treasures belong in their museums, the real question is, who truly deserves reparations? The monarchy and aristocracy that grew rich from Africa's suffering, or the people whose ancestors were stripped of their history, wealth, and dignity? For centuries, the British monarchy has stood as a symbol of power, wealth, and empire. But much of that wealth was built on the suffering of colonized nations. funded by slavery, resource extraction, and the looting of treasures from Africa and beyond. From the early days of the transatlantic slave trade, the British Crown played a direct role in profiting from Africa's exploitation. Queen Elizabeth I financed some of the first slave voyages. King Charles II granted a royal charter to the Royal African Company, which trafficked thousands of enslaved Africans across the Atlantic. The Stuart and Hanoverian kings used profits from slavery and colonial trade to expand royal estates and influence global politics. As Britain's empire grew, so did the monarchy's wealth. The grand palaces of today, Buckingham, Windsor, and Kensington, were funded by the economic gains of empire. And even now, many of the jewels worn by British royals tell a story of colonial conquest. Some of the most famous jewels in the world have African origins, but not by choice. They were taken during Britain's colonial rule, polished and set into royal regalia, becoming symbols of empire. The largest diamond ever found, the Great Star of Africa, was discovered in South Africa in 1905, at a time when Britain controlled the region. It was soon claimed by the British Crown. Today, King Charles III still holds it as part of the crown jewels, despite South Africa's calls for its return. Though taken from India, the Koh-i-Noor diamond represents the vast network of colonial theft that extended beyond Africa. This massive gemstone was forcibly taken under British rule and passed down through generations of British queens. Today, it remains locked in royal regalia, an unspoken reminder of Britain's imperial past. And it's not just jewels. Royal collections still contain stolen African treasures, gold from Ghana, bronzes from Nigeria, manuscripts from Ethiopia, all held by the monarchy or displayed in Britain's national museums. In recent years, Britain's colonial past has come under greater scrutiny. King Charles III has acknowledged the painful history of empire, even expressing deep sorrow for the transatlantic slave trade. But are words enough? Despite public statements, the monarchy has yet to take concrete steps toward repatriation. The stolen artifacts remain in Britain. The crown jewels are still proudly displayed, and reparations for the descendants of those impacted by colonialism remain an unresolved demand. Other European nations have begun returning their stolen artifacts. Germany has repatriated Benin Bronzes. France has sent back treasures to West Africa. But Britain? It continues to resist, arguing that these items belong in universal museums, a weak defense against undeniable historical theft. Returning looted artifacts is just the beginning, while stolen treasures remain locked away in museums and royal collections. The deeper issue is the stolen wealth that fueled Britain's rise, and the generations still suffering because of it. For centuries, Africa and the Caribbean were exploited for their resources and labor. The transatlantic slave trade generated immense profits for Britain's monarchy, banks, and industries. Even after slavery was abolished, the British government paid reparations, not to the formerly enslaved, but to the slave owners. That compensation, worth billions in today's money, helped build the financial and political power that still dominates Britain today. Meanwhile, the descendants of enslaved Africans were left with nothing: no land, no wealth, no generational stability. And the effects of this are still felt today. The legacy of colonialism and slavery isn't just history, it's shaping the lives of young black people today. In the UK, black Britons face higher unemployment rates, wage gaps, and barriers to housing and education. Generations of African and Caribbean communities built Britain, yet they are still fighting for basic rights and opportunities. The wealth generated from colonialism is still visible in Britain's institutions, elite universities, banks, and royal estates, all benefited from the profits of slavery. Meanwhile, the African and Caribbean communities whose ancestors built that wealth are still struggling to secure their share. One of the clearest examples of Britain's failure to reckon with its colonial past is the Windrush scandal. Thousands of Caribbean immigrants, descendants of enslaved Africans, were invited to help. They worked in hospitals, on transport systems, and in public services, helping to rebuild the nation. But decades later, the British government turned its back on them. Many Windrush descendants, who had lived in Britain their entire lives, were wrongly detained, deported, or denied healthcare and housing. The very people who built modern Britain were discarded, treated as outsiders in a country they had served. This scandal wasn't just a mistake, it was the result of Britain's long history of exploiting black people while refusing to acknowledge their contributions. And it's why the call for reparations is growing louder. If Britain acknowledges the damage it has done, then the question remains, who deserves justice? Should the descendants of enslaved Africans be compensated for the wealth stolen from their ancestors? Should African nations receive financial reparations for the resources looted during colonial rule? Should Black Britons, who still face systemic racism, be supported with economic programs? Many former colonies, like Barbados and Jamaica, have already begun cutting ties with the British monarchy and demanding reparations. In Africa, countries like Nigeria, Ghana and Ethiopia have long called for their stolen treasures and wealth to be returned. And in Britain itself, black communities continue to push for systemic change. The debate over reparations isn't just about money, it's about justice. It's about acknowledging the crimes of the past and making real efforts to repair the damage. Britain built its empire on the backs of African and Caribbean people. Now, will it finally take responsibility? So what would true reparations look like? African leaders and activists have made it clear. Returning stolen artifacts is just the start. They are demanding direct financial compensation for the centuries of exploitation, economic investment in the nations and communities affected, and a commitment to repairing the deep inequalities caused by colonial rule. Germany has paid reparations to Namibia for the genocide of the Herero and Nama people. France paid Haiti, though in an unjust twist, it forced Haiti to compensate former slave owners. Holocaust survivors have received financial reparations from Germany acknowledging their suffering. Yet, for the millions of Africans and their descendants impacted by the transatlantic slave trade, Britain has yet to pay a single penny. Why? Thank you for watching another Fresh K documentary. If you want to see more content like this, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications.